real examples. How blockchain is shaping the public sector. Mr. Jamie Berryhill, blockchain lead for the Public Governance Director at OECD, France.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I am from the OECD, and in case you're not familiar, the OECD is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We're an intergovernmental organization of 36 member countries. We kind of describe ourselves sometimes as a mini United Nations, but for policy analysis and economic research. And within the OECD, I'm part of the Observatory of Public Sector Innovation, a small team of 9 or 10 people. We have a bit of a three-pronged mission within OPSI, within the observatory. One is to uncover what's next in governments, identify new practices and trends at the edge of government. Two being providing trusted advice to foster innovation in governments around the world, both globally and one-on-one, working on specific projects with member and partner countries. And additionally, turning the new into normal, so studying innovation in the public sector, different contexts, different frameworks and models governments can apply. And within this mission, we work with government employees and government partners in civil society and private sector on an everyday basis. While not all innovation in the public sector is digital, we find that there's a lot of questions and a lot of interest in governments, specifically in the digital aspects of innovation. And lately, blockchain has been one of the things that people come to us the most about, with a lot of questions. So we put out this blockchain primer called Blockchain's Unchained Guide for Civil Servants. And while a lot of the discussion I think I've heard so far today really kind of goes into a lot of the different interesting uses, but also the technical aspects of it, civil servants, when they come to us, tend to have fairly simple concerns and things that they're interested in and want to learn more about. And we saw a big demand for basically a simple primer and a simple guide on what blockchain is, what it might be used for, what it might not be good for, and what some of the other limitations or things to think about are for government. Part of it was just because of the complexity of the technology. People had a hard time grasping what it was, especially at a policy level in the center of government, where people have a cross-cutting, broad portfolio where it's hard to dive deep into one specific technology. So we created this guide to explain what it is, make a case for public servants to build knowledge and capacity around blockchain, and understand its potential impacts, and to do a few case studies, which I will provide more of a broad overview of kind of government use of blockchain and maybe touch on a couple of case studies, but not like the specific deep dive into particular applications. As of a couple months ago, so we need to update a little bit, we're seeing about at least 203 distinct blockchain initiatives in 46 different countries around the world. When we did similar research about a year ago, or about a year before this came out, it was about half that. So we're seeing tremendous growth, tremendous and like rapid acceleration in government's interest in blockchain and desire to kind of start experimenting in that space. And there's been a lot of different barriers that have come down in the last year or so that are helping to facilitate this. But I would say that if we did this research now, we did this in April, it would even grow much more than that now. The things that we're seeing the most, the biggest one, I think, which demonstrates the tremendous growth in the future, is that most of these implementations, or excuse me, these projects aren't actually in the implementation stage quite yet, or they're more in the area of government-wide strategies and different initiative strategies before you even kind of open the door to really getting these projects in. So most government applications of blockchain that we're seeing are more in the strategy development phase before they actually even start implementing. A lot of interest in identity and credentials, which is often one of the more complicated ones, but governments are really diving into that. Personal records, economic development, financial services, land title registry, which I really like, and I like the case study from earlier because I think it really seems kind of like the clearest cut, easiest to understand use case for blockchain. Experimenting with digital currencies, benefits entitlement, and compliance and research. Most of these in the government services realm, a lot of them financial, but actually a lot less than I would have expected. And then kind of like working your way down to the different sectors within government. But we're seeing tremendous interest, and people come to us every day with questions and want to kind of get the ball rolling on this. One of the ones that, a couple case studies that we cover in our blockchain primer guide for civil servants is an experiment and proof of concept that Denmark is doing, where they're trying to track cars from their life cycle, which is a fairly simple, clean-cut use of blockchain. So during a car's life cycle, it goes from various phases, from the time it's purchased from or built, to the time it's purchased from the first party, to the time it's handed off, until it's kind of down the line until it's decommissioned. And the Danish government partnered up with a startup to help build a blockchain tracking system, which isn't fully implemented yet, but they're still experimenting with it and hope to deploy larger. And it kind of addresses the problem of like more secretive handoffs of vehicles and sales to ensure that things are being done that minimizes the risk of the buyer, minimizes the risk of the seller, but also to ensure the government is getting all of the tax benefits and taxes it's due from those sales and purchases. Just another quick one is an interesting use in land title registry. So Ben in Ghana is a private startup that is partnered with the government to develop a new land title registry system across the country. Before, this was a super fragmented process. There wasn't a universal way of conducting this. The sale of a home or the sale of a building would often take months or a year or more to fully conduct the transaction. And afterwards, there was incredible disputes about who owned what, whether it was done properly, whether the person who sold it to the other person actually owned it in the first place. So they've actually gone down to reducing the transaction times by 75% and reducing tremendously the disputes as well. And I think that what we're witnessing in the observatory anyways, the government's more and more trying to do the land use as an initial test case. Because it is one of the simpler applications. So I think that, so we have some limitations up here. And these are based on the questions that civil servants have to us when they come and they're starting to explore blockchain or they're interested in learning more. And there's things that they have, or kind of conceptions they have in their head about what blockchain can be used for and what its limitations are. And I think that to them, one of the biggest benefits of blockchain, but also one of the biggest limitations, is the immutability aspect of it. So as we all know, that blockchain is just an add-only list, and once you add it, you can't really remove it. You can kind of layer on top and layer on top, but most of what governments are doing on a day-to-day basis or come to us and wonder if blockchain is a valid use case for is simple kind of data entry and data maintenance on records that can change on a regular basis and that they're constantly updating, and which we work with them to perhaps think of a different solution, as this might not be something that governments would be wanting to use blockchain for. Another one would be data storage. A lot of policymakers and their staff are looking for solutions for data storage, and they're like, oh, we want to use blockchain, and we have a lot of files that we want to be storing, and we have a tremendous amount of data. And they will have some conceptions that blockchain is a good storage solution. But as we know that it's designed for kind of small pockets of data and isn't really meant to be a storage solution in itself. And there's a lot of misconceptions in the public sector about how you can put something on the blockchain and something off the chain and connect them in some way with like links and keys. But another common one is that, so if a data storage solution is what was really needed, blockchain might not be the best fit. Another common challenge that we meet with government officials is just simply talking about blockchain or understanding blockchain. So the pockets inside the civil services of the countries that we work with, there are groups of folks that really do know a lot about blockchain. And part of the difficulty for them is working with other pockets or other parts of government and actually just explaining what the technology is and how it can be used and how perhaps it might not be used. And we're seeing a growth of kind of technology offices emerge that specialize in emerging technologies like blockchain, whose essential duty is to talk about the technology across the public administration of the country, and to get people on board with what it is and how it might be used, and to kind of convene people who are like-minded and interested in the technology to see how they can experiment with it. I think a good example of this would be in the United States. They've launched an Emerging Citizen Technology Office. So it's an office at the center of government that is all about teaching civil servants what emerging technology is and how it can be used, and engaging in experiments with them. Another one, a challenge and limitation that is going down and down over time, is the cost. So there's oftentimes a higher term, short-term cost associated with emerging technologies like blockchain. I think over the last year and a half or so, we've seen a lot of this particular barrier come down, especially with like blockchain as a service technologies that are getting spun up, where you're able to kind of start experimenting with instances of blockchain without having to build a whole operation around it. And this has been a particular interest to governments, is partnering with private sector companies that can help them kind of get off the ground without a huge investment up front for small experiments before in order to kind of really get their feet wet before they decide if they want to learn more. Number 5 here is actually, I think, number 1 to me, in that almost all of the folks that we talk to at first they go out and they talk to people in government about wanting to experiment with blockchain, and they get a lot of blockers that aren't actually terribly relevant. The most common one that we hear is that somebody's interested in experimenting with a blockchain process or application for something like land title registry, for example. And they'll get blockers that shut down their project because someone says that it's going to require a tremendous amount of energy consumption, for example, which is the most common one we hear. But for most of the applications that governments are going to be using, or at least starting with, that wouldn't really apply. The energy restriction is just for a very specific type of blockchain implementation that most of these people won't be facing or have to think about at all, except for the fact that they need to be able to explain how it's not relevant for what they're trying to do. But I'd say at least half of the projects that we've seen kind of trying to get started off the ground will be knocked down and kind of like put to rest because of some of these limitations. Another one, just being like the association with Bitcoin is another blocker that people raise because someone says they want to do a blockchain implementation for an identity program or experiment with that. And they think that there's all these connections with illicit trade and just the volatility of the Bitcoin market, even though a lot of these implementations would absolutely have no association with Bitcoin or even currency whatsoever. And I think the 6th one here that we really try to talk about with the civil servants we work with is that the kind of somewhat of a misconception that blockchain will allow them to totally decentralize a process, or the belief that blockchain's full purpose is to totally decentralize and remove the need for any sort of centralized authority for conducting transactions. But it's really important that, especially in public sector, when you're using blockchain, to consider the coding and the governance models behind the development of it, because although there is ways that blockchain can reduce the need for third parties, there's always people that are responsible for governing the decisions behind the way a blockchain is built and for coding it and developing it. And these are often hidden parties that where you often have in a traditional like data implementation, you have an obvious third-party authority that's managing things. But a lot of the times with blockchains, the conception that it's decentralized and there's no third party almost makes the people that do make the decisions a little bit more hidden. And governments are doing most of these things with the private sector, and the responsibility will always fall to the public sector. So it's really important that the civil servants and the policymakers be aware of all the decisions and all of the people that contribute to the decisions on how the blockchain implementations are built and governed. And I think my last slide here is just something that I saw just on Twitter this past week, where the US National Institute for Standards and Technology put out this kind of their own primer for blockchain implementation. And I thought this was an interesting flowchart in helping civil servants consider the different options that are available to them. A lot of times they come to us and they just want to use blockchain for the purpose of using blockchain because they hear other people are doing it and they want to get on board. But for a lot of the use cases that they're trying to do, it might not be the best fit. It might be the best fit, but there's other things that they should consider and weigh the pros and cons of actually using blockchain for these services, because in a lot of the cases, there's a simple cloud solution in a software as a service or a database or an encrypted database that could do the job best. And there's a lot of instances where blockchain would be incredibly valuable to them. So I think thinking about things like, do you need many people to be having their kind of like hands in the data and contributing files? Do you really need to have that immutability aspect that everything's kind of set in stone? Do you have trouble with governance and deciding who's able to contribute these things? I think these are all things that governments really need to be thinking about when they're kind of getting involved in blockchain and starting to think about which kind of services and applications and things like that they might want to start developing. And I think there's a tremendous market for the spaces where blockchain does fit. I think there's tremendous markets for the more traditional players as well, where sometimes maybe you just need a spreadsheet, or sometimes maybe you need an online database. But I added this in last minute because I thought it was interesting. So just wrapping up, if you're interested in the work that the OECD is doing in this space, or you're interested in other aspects of public sector innovation, we'd invite you to check out our website at oecd-opsi.org, or on Twitter, or sign up to our newsletter. We work primarily with centers of government in OECD countries, but we also, on an increasing basis, are working with cities, are working with subnational governments like states and regionals, and working with private sector partners of governments and civil society organizations to build a community around public sector innovation and to try to connect the different people and the different groups in the digital ecosystem to learn from each other and understand each other's kind of barriers and limitations and methods of work. I think that, as we probably all know, there's sometimes difficulties in crossing the different groups, and part of our role is to try to bring people together to have these kinds of conversations where we can all learn from each other. So it's been great being here, and thanks for having me.